Cornelius Barker had not spoken a tender word to another living soul in 25 years, and the land had never once asked him to. That was the truth of it, plain and simple as the red earth that stretched from the base of his porch, steps all the way to the horizon, a rolling, breathing canvas of scrub oak and buffalo grass and limestone outcroppings that caught the evening light and turned to something very nearly holy. He had bought this land in 1868, fresh out of the war with nothing but $30, a mule named Theodore, and a stubbornness that his mother had always called his best and worst quality in equal measure. He had worked every acre of it himself. He had built the house with timber hauled down from the hill country, fitted each board with his own calloused hands, chinked every gap with mud and determination. He had dug the well, strung the fence, cleared the mesquite from the south pasture, and coaxed a cattle operation out of ground that most sensible men would have looked at and simply kept riding. By the spring of 1893, Cornelius Barker was 47 years old, and he owned 1,200 acres in the hill country of central Texas, a modest but sound herd of nearly 300 longhorns, a horse he trusted completely, and an absolute certainty that this was enough, that a man did not need more than this. That the land, in all its severity and beauty, in its indifference and its occasional breathtaking generosity, was sufficient company for any reasonable person willing to accept the terms. He had, over the years, allowed himself almost nothing else. He had a hired man named Dooley Fitch who slept in the bunkhouse and did most of the fence work, and never said more than was necessary, which Cornelius appreciated enormously. He had a woman named Mrs. Hattie Grubb in the town of Caldwell, who sold him flour and salt and coffee, and asked him no personal questions beyond whether he needed help loading his wagon, which he never did. He had, on 3 separate occasions across 25 years, briefly entertained the notion that a wife might be a practical addition to the operation, and on each occasion he had filed the thought away in the same drawer where he kept things that were probably someone else's business, and closed it firmly shut. He did not consider himself a lonely man. He considered himself a man who had found his arrangement with the world and made his peace with it. The morning that changed everything began the same way every other morning began, which was to say that Cornelius woke before the sun, pulled on his boots in the dark, walked to the kitchen, and set the coffee on before stepping outside to check the sky. It was a habit so deeply ingrained it had ceased to feel like a choice, and had become instead simply the shape of his existence. He stood on the porch with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked east, where the dark was just beginning to turn the deep, bruised purple that preceded the first pale seam of gold along the horizon. It was a Tuesday in early April of 1893, and the air smelled like rain that had fallen 2 nights prior and dried into the earth, that particular sweetness that the Texas hill country offered after a good rain, something green and mineral and alive. The cattle were quiet in the near pasture. Theodore II, his roan gelding and the spiritual descendant of the original Theodore who had died in 1879 with tremendous dignity, stood motionless at the fence with his neck stretched over the rail as if contemplating something profound. Cornelius was watching the sunrise begin its slow, magnificent performance when he saw her. She was on foot, which was the first strange thing. The second strange thing was that she was coming from the west, which meant she had crossed 3 miles of open range from the direction of the county road, and the county road was 3 miles from anything, and she was walking like a woman who had been walking for a very long time, and had decided that stopping was simply not an option she was going to consider. She had a carpet bag in one hand and what appeared to be a hat in the other, because the hat was not on her head where it belonged but held out to her side at an angle, as if she had stopped caring about it approximately 2 miles back and was only still holding it out of sheer habit. Her dark hair had largely escaped whatever arrangement she had put it in and was blowing loose around her shoulders. She was wearing a blue dress that had been, at some earlier point in its life, a fine piece of clothing, and was currently covered from the hem to the knee in red Texas dust. Cornelius stood very still on his porch and watched her cross his land. She walked across the south pasture with the kind of deliberate stride that spoke of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out. And she came directly toward the house, as if she had known exactly where it was all along, even though it was not visible from the road at this distance, and would have required walking the whole 3 miles before it came into view over the gentle rise of the hill. She reached the gate in the yard fence, wrestled the latch open with her free hand without slowing down appreciably, came through it, and stopped at the base of the porch steps. She looked up at him with a pair of green eyes that were simultaneously exhausted and absolutely unyielding, and she said, "I am looking for Cornelius Barker. I have been informed he owns this property. I am Opal Sawyer, and I have walked from the county road because the wagon that was supposed to bring me here left without me at the Caldwell Depot 3 days ago, and I have subsequently spent those 3 days attempting to locate someone who could direct me to this ranch, and I am now here. I would very much appreciate a glass of water before we discuss anything else." Cornelius Barker stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm Cornelius Barker. I had assumed," she said. "Come up on the porch," he said. She climbed the steps with the kind of careful, deliberate movement that told him her feet hurt considerably, and she sat down in the single chair he kept by the door, set the carpet bag on the boards beside it, and placed the hat in her lap, and folded her hands on top of the hat, and looked at him with those green eyes that had not softened a single degree. He went inside and got her a tin cup of water from the pitcher on the sideboard, and then, after a moment's thought, he got one of water for himself and brought the coffee pot out too, because it seemed like a situation that called for coffee. She drank the entire cup of water without pausing and held it out to him. He refilled it. She drank half of that and then seemed to remember that she was a person who did things with some degree of social grace because she took a breath and said, "Thank you." "You said you're Opal Sawyer," Cornelius said. "I did." He looked at her. She looked at him. The silence stretched between them with the particular quality of a silence in which one person knows something the other person has not yet said, and both parties are aware of this fact. "I wrote to a matrimonial agency," he said finally, "in March." "You did," she said. "They wrote back in March." "They did." "And they said they had a suitable match." "They said they did," Opal agreed, "and that match was me. And I wrote to you, and you wrote to me, and we agreed that I would arrive on the 22nd of April, which was 3 days ago, and I was on that train, and there was a man at the station who was supposed to be driving your wagon to collect me. And that man, for reasons I have not been able to fully determine, left the station before I disembarked, and I have since spent 3 days in Caldwell at the boarding house operated by a Mrs. Grubb, who was very kind but who also asked me quite a number of questions I was not prepared to answer, and I have now walked here, and I am here, and I would like to know what you intend to do about that." Cornelius sat down on the porch rail, which he did not usually do because he was not in the habit of sitting on porch rails, but it seemed like the correct response to the moment. He looked at Opal Sawyer. She was, he estimated, somewhere in her early 30s, so perhaps 31 or 32, which the agency had confirmed, and she was a woman who had clearly walked 3 miles in difficult circumstances, and was refusing to allow those circumstances to make her appear anything less than composed. There was mud on the hem of her dress. There was a blister on her left hand from the carpet bag handle, visible where she had moved the hat to reach for the water. Her hair was, objectively, a disaster. She met his eyes without flinching. He had not, in all his 25 years alone on this land, thought very much about what it would actually mean to have a woman appear on his porch. He had thought about it the way a man thinks about the possibility of rain when the weather turns west, practically and without sentiment, as a solution to a particular set of logistical problems. He needed someone to manage the house. He needed someone to keep the accounts, because his own bookkeeping was, in his private assessment, a genuine disgrace. He had reasoned that a wife was a sensible addition in the way that a new fence post was a sensible addition. You put it in because the fence needed it. Looking at Opal Sawyer on his porch with her ruined dress and her exhausted green eyes and her absolutely undefeated spine, he felt something shift inside his chest that he had no ready word for, and so he set it aside and returned to the practical matter at hand. "The man I sent was Dooley Fitch," he said. "I'll have words with him about that." "I would appreciate it," she said. "You walked 3 miles." "I did. In those shoes." She looked down at her shoes, which had not been designed for cross-country walking, and then back up at him. "I did not have other options available to me." "No," he said. "I suppose you didn't." He pulled himself off the rail and stood. "There's coffee. And I can make eggs. The letters said you're from San Antonio." "I am. I taught school there for 7 years. The school closed." She paused. "The agency told you all of this." "They did," he said. "It's different hearing it from you." She seemed to find this an unusual thing for him to say because something flickered briefly behind her eyes, not softness exactly, but something alert and considering. "I suppose it is," she said. He made her eggs and coffee, and she ate at his kitchen table with the contained efficiency of someone who was hungry and was not going to pretend she wasn't. And he sat across from her and drank his coffee and told her briefly about the ranch, the acreage, the herd, the water situation, the house, which had 2 rooms that were not currently being used and which could be made comfortable with some effort. He had not, he admitted, made particular preparation for her arrival beyond ensuring those 2 rooms were empty, which was the best he could offer. She asked him 7 precise, practical questions about the well, the kitchen stove, the nearest town, the school in Caldwell, and whether it was operating, the state of his accounts, the approximate income from the herd, and the nature of Dooley Fitch's temperament. He answered all of them as honestly as he could. She listened to each answer with complete attention and then nodded once, as if filing it. When she was finished, she set her fork down and said, "I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Barker, because I think that serves both of us better than any kind of performance." "I'd prefer it," he said. "I have no illusions about what this arrangement is. I am not a romantic person by nature. I am a practical one. I am 31 years old and I have been teaching other people's children for 7 years. And when the school closed, I had 3 months of savings and no particular prospects in San Antonio. And I am not interested in becoming a burden to my brother in Austin, who has enough on his hands already. I would like a home and a purpose. I believe I can manage a household and keep accounts and be a useful partner in running this ranch. I cannot promise you more than that at present, and I think it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise." Cornelius looked at her for a long moment. He said, "That's a fair accounting." "It is," she agreed. "And what about you?" He considered this. He was not, as he had established firmly in his own mind over 25 years, a man who examined his interior landscape with any particular frequency. The exterior one demanded enough attention, but she had asked directly and she deserved a direct answer. "I've run this ranch alone for a long time," he said. "I'm set in how I do things. I know that. I'm not an easy man to live alongside. But I'm a fair one and I'll work as hard as you need me to, and I won't lie to you and I won't be cruel. That's what I can offer." She studied him with those green eyes for what felt like a considerable time. Then she said, "That's also a fair accounting." They were married in the front parlor of the Caldwell courthouse 5 days later, on a Monday morning in late April, with the judge and his clerk and Hattie Grubb as witnesses, because Mrs. Grubb had somehow managed to insert herself into the proceedings through a combination of goodwill and sheer momentum that neither Cornelius nor Opal had found a polite way to resist. Opal wore a clean dress of dark green wool that she had pressed herself in the boarding house the night before. Cornelius wore his only good shirt and had made an effort with his hair that Opal noted without comment. The ceremony took 9 minutes. Mrs. Grubb cried. The clerk looked bored. The judge shook their hands and wished them well. They drove back to the ranch in the wagon in comfortable silence, which Cornelius found unexpectedly easy, and Opal seemed to find so as well. And he showed her the house again properly this time, with more detail than the first morning had allowed, and she walked through each room with her hands clasped behind her back and her head slightly tilted, cataloging everything with those quick, intelligent eyes. And he followed her and said nothing, because he understood instinctively that she needed to see it and take the measure of it before she would be ready to speak. She stood in the doorway of what would be her bedroom and looked at it for a long time. It was a plain room, a bed with a frame he had built from cedar, a single window that faced west so that it caught the evening light, a washstand, a small chest of drawers. He had put a jar of wildflowers on the chest of drawers that morning, because he had woken before dawn and walked out into the south pasture, where the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush were coming in thick after the rain, and he had cut some without quite knowing why he was doing it, only that it seemed like the right thing for the room to have. Opal looked at the flowers for a moment and then looked at him, and he met her eyes and looked away first, which surprised him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "They were already there," he said, which was not entirely untrue since he had only moved them from the pasture to the jar, and was also not exactly true in the sense that mattered, and he thought she probably understood both of these things simultaneously, because she had a way of looking at a person that suggested she was hearing all the versions of what they said at once. In those first weeks, they navigated around each other with care. The house, which had for 25 years been organized entirely around the habits and preferences of one person, had to rearrange itself around two, and this was accomplished by a series of small negotiations, some spoken and many not. She took over the kitchen completely and without ceremony on the second day, and produced from it meals that made Cornelius close his eyes briefly over his plate, not because he was an emotional man about food, but because he had been eating his own cooking for so long that the experience of eating something that had been made with genuine skill and care was very nearly overwhelming in its ordinariness. She organized the accounts on the third day, sitting at the kitchen table with his ledger book spread before her, working through them in complete silence for 6 hours, with the expression of someone performing a surgical procedure on a patient who had been badly neglected. She did not comment on the state of the bookkeeping except to say, that evening, "You have been significantly undercharging the Hallett brothers for their share of the water rights from the East Creek. You have also been overpaying your supply account at the general store, I believe due to an error in the original contract. I would like to write some letters on your behalf if you have no objection." "Write whatever letters you think are needed," he said. She nodded and returned to the ledger, and he sat on his side of the table and drank his coffee and watched her work, and thought that there was something remarkably settling about another person in the house, about the sound of another person's breathing and the scratch of their pen and the small, constant evidence of their presence. He had not known he was missing it. He had been very sure he was not missing it. That certainty had begun to develop some cracks. He did not examine the cracks. He was a man who believed strongly in the value of sound construction, and he knew that what you did with a crack was address it before it became a problem. But he was not yet sure what addressing this particular crack would look like, and so, for the moment, he left it. There was a problem that arrived in May, and it arrived in the form of a man named Garrett Hollies. Garrett Hollies was a rancher of the neighboring property to the northwest, a man of 42 who had made his operation successful through a combination of genuine capability and a willingness to use his size and influence in ways that were not always strictly above the reach of the law, but were very difficult to prove otherwise. He had, over the years, made several attempts to purchase the creek rights on Cornelius's eastern boundary, because those creek rights fed his cattle through the dry summer months, and Cornelius had declined each attempt with a brevity and finality that Hollies had never quite been able to accept as definitive. He arrived at the Barker Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon in late May with two of his men, riding horses that cost more than most people in Caldwell made in a year, and he came to the door of the house, where Opal answered it because Cornelius was in the far pasture checking a section of fence that Dooley had reported was coming loose. Opal, who had never met Garrett Hollies, opened the door and looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, reassessment, and a species of charm that was smooth and practiced, and which Opal identified immediately as the kind of charm that is worn rather than felt, like a well-fitted coat. "Well," Holly said, "I wasn't told Cornelius Barker had gotten himself a wife. That is the sort of information that would be difficult to know without being told," Opal said pleasantly. "I'm Mrs. Barker. My husband is on the property. I can send for him if you'd like to wait, or I can take a message." Holly smiled. He had, objectively, a fine smile, the kind that lived in the lower half of his face while the upper half of his face thought about other things. "I'll wait," he said. "It's nothing that can't be discussed over a cup of that coffee I smell." Opal did not particularly want to give Garrett Hollies coffee, but she was not a woman who acted on things she could not yet justify, and so she let him in and poured coffee and sat across the table from him, while he talked about the ranch and the weather and the price of cattle and the general state of the county, with the expansive, proprietary ease of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and having them accommodate him. She listened and said little, and watched his eyes, which moved around the house with an assessing quality that had very little to do with genuine interest in the decor, and everything to do with calculation. Cornelius arrived 20 minutes later, came through the back door with his boots still dirty and his hat in his hand, and stopped very briefly when he saw Hollies at his kitchen table with his wife across from him, and then he said, "Hollies." "Barker," Hollies said, standing and extending his hand. "Your wife has been wonderful company. I can see why you kept her a secret." Cornelius shook his hand with the efficient brevity of a man who is shaking a hand because social convention requires it and not for any other reason. "What brings you out?" They talked on the porch. Opal stayed inside, but she could hear them through the window she had left open for the breeze, and she listened to Hollies make another offer on the creek rights, this one considerably higher than the previous ones, framed in the language of neighborly generosity and mutual benefit, and she listened to Cornelius decline it in terms that were exactly as brief and final as all the previous refusals, and she listened to the conversation end with Hollies' smile audible in his voice as he said, "The offer stands. You know where to find me when you change your mind." When Cornelius came back inside, Opal was at the stove stirring something. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the far counter and said, "He make you uncomfortable?" She considered this. "No, but he made me careful, which is a different thing." Cornelius looked at her. "What did you make of him?" She set down the spoon and turned to face him. "I think he's the kind of man who is patient in proportion to how certain he is of eventually getting what he wants, and I think he is currently quite certain." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's exactly right. The creek rights are important," she said. It was not a question. "Without the East Creek, the South and East pastures are unusable in August and September. I'd lose a third of my grazing range. Then we should make sure the rights are documented as thoroughly as possible," she said. "I would like to look at the original land grant paperwork this evening." He looked at her for a moment, this woman who had been on his property for 5 weeks and had already, apparently, decided to defend it with the same absolute conviction that he had carried for 25 years. Something in his chest did the thing again, the unnamed shifting, only this time it was larger and less easy to set aside. "It's in the lockbox," he said, "under the bed in my room." "I'll look at it after supper," she said, and turned back to the stove. He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he went to wash up. June came in hot and brilliant, the hill country turning green and gold under a sun that had decided to make its intentions absolutely clear, and with it came the rhythms of a life that was, Cornelius found, to his genuine bewilderment, deeply pleasant. He rode out in the mornings and came back for the midday meal, and rode out again and came back at dusk. And there was always a lamp lit in the kitchen window when he came over the rise toward the house, and Opal was always at the table or the stove or the porch, and the sound of another person's presence in the house had stopped feeling strange and had started feeling like something he was not sure he could account for. He began to notice her in the way that you notice the land after rain, that particular sharpness of detail that comes when something familiar is suddenly more vivid than it was before. He noticed the way she read with her finger tracing the line of text, not because she needed to, but because she was following the words closely, and that was how she marked her attention. He noticed that she laughed very quietly and almost to herself, a low sound that she seemed to be making more for her own private satisfaction than for any audience, and that it happened most often when she was reading something or watching the behavior of the cattle through the kitchen window, which she found genuinely funny in ways she would occasionally describe to him in the evenings with a dry precision that made him laugh too, which surprised him every time. He noticed that she walked out onto the land every afternoon. She had done this from the first week, taken an hour in the late afternoon and simply walked out into the south pasture or along the creek bank or up toward the limestone ridge to the east, and she came back with her boots dusty and her hair wind-blown, and her eyes carrying something that looked like the closest thing to peace that he had seen on a person's face. He asked her about it one evening in late June as she was coming back through the yard gate. "Why do you walk out?" he said. She came up the porch steps and stopped and looked out at the land for a moment before answering. The sun was going down behind the low hills to the west, and the sky was the particular shade of amber and rose that only happened in that specific stretch of Texas in that specific hour, and the light was lying across the land in long, warm lines that made even the scrub oak look beautiful. "Because it's extraordinary," she said simply. "I grew up in San Antonio. The land there is different, flatter, more people on it. This is something else entirely." She paused. "When I walk out there in the late afternoon, and the light does what it's doing right now, I think about the fact that this exact light has been falling on this exact ground for thousands of years before we were here, and will continue falling on it for thousands of years after we're gone, and it makes everything feel appropriately sized." Cornelius turned this over. He had loved this land for 25 years and had never once put words to why, because he had not thought it needed words. It simply was what it was, and he was in it, and the being in it was sufficient. But listening to Opal describe it, he felt the strangeness of something seen from outside, which is that it becomes visible in a way that seeing it from the inside never quite allows. "You love it," he said, with some surprise in his voice. She looked at him then, and he looked back, and the amber light was on her face and in her green eyes and on the loose dark hair at her temples, and she said, "How could anyone not?" He stood there on his porch in the light that she had just described as falling on this ground for thousands of years, and he thought that he had loved this land more than he had loved anything alive, more than his horse and his cattle, and certainly more than any person, because people complicated things and the land was honest about what it was, and he had called that clarity and told himself it was enough. And looking at her standing in his amber light talking about his limestone ridge as if it were something she had been given custody of alongside him, he felt the full, particular weight of a man realizing he has been wrong about something essential. He did not say this. He was not a man who said things before he had worked them through properly, but the crack in his certainty opened considerably that evening, and he sat on the porch after she went inside and watched the stars come out over his 1,200 acres and thought about what it meant to love a thing that could not love you back. The trouble with Garrett Hollies escalated in July. It began with fencing. Someone cut the wire on the eastern boundary, the section closest to the creek, on 3 separate occasions in the first 2 weeks of July. Cornelius repaired it each time. Dooley Fitch, who slept lightly and had the instincts of a man who had spent 20 years keeping things intact, began sleeping in the barn on the nights when the wind came from the northwest, which was Hollis's direction, and on the fourth occasion reported at first light that he had heard horses in the dark near the east fence, but had not been close enough in time to see who it was. Cornelius rode to Caldwell and spoke to the county sheriff, a man named Archie Payne, who was genuinely competent and genuinely constrained by the same evidentiary requirements that governed everyone. Without proof of who was cutting the wire, there was very little Archie Payne could do beyond noting the complaint, which he did, and suggesting that Cornelius maintain a watch, which Cornelius was already doing. Opal heard all of this and said nothing for a day, and then said, "I think Hollis is trying to make the ranch difficult to manage. Not to steal the creek rights, but to make you want to sell them." "Could be," Cornelius said. "He doesn't strike me as a man who wants to win through force if patience is available," she said. "He wants you to get tired of the trouble and decide the creek rights aren't worth protecting." Cornelius looked at her. "You worked him out from one conversation. I had a classroom full of children who were trying to get what they wanted through various indirect methods for 7 years," she said. "The strategies are not so different." He almost smiled. He did not quite get there, but the effort was visible, and she noticed it, and she returned it with a small smile of her own that she directed at the window, and he looked at her profile in the kitchen light and thought, not for the first time, that he had been tremendously underestimating what he was getting when he sent that letter to the matrimonial agency. He had thought he was solving a problem. He was beginning to think he had been handed something he did not have the full vocabulary to name. In August, she found the survey map. She had been going through the original land grant paperwork with the thoroughness she applied to everything, and she found a survey map from 1868 that showed the original property boundary running slightly differently in the northeast corner than the current fence line, which had been moved sometime in the years since, not by Cornelius, who had not moved it, but by someone before him, or by the neighbor who had held that property before Hollis bought it in 1881. The difference was approximately 40 yards, but those 40 yards contained a section of the creek bank that was, according to the original survey, clearly within the Barker property. She brought the map to Cornelius at the kitchen table after supper on a Thursday evening in August and spread it out and showed him the discrepancy without preamble. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "I never looked at this map that carefully." "The fence was moved before you bought the land," she said. "Which means either the previous owner made an error or the previous owner reached an agreement with his neighbor that was never properly documented, or something else entirely. But in any case, the original survey is what the land grant is based on, and the land grant is the legal record." He looked at her. "You're saying we have a legal claim to a section of the creek that's currently being treated as Hollis's." "I am saying we should consult a lawyer about the land grant as soon as possible," she said carefully. "Because if that survey holds, it substantially changes the nature of any negotiation Hollis thinks he has leverage in." He rode to Austin in September and retained a lawyer named Marcus Webb, who came highly recommended by Opal's brother there, a schoolteacher named James Sawyer who turned out to be both useful and pleasant, and who visited the ranch that fall and spent 3 days helping Opal go through every piece of documentation in the lockbox with the methodical care that seemed to be a family characteristic. Opal's brother James was 28 and a lively conversationalist, and his presence in the house for those 3 days created a kind of ease that Cornelius had not anticipated. James talked easily about everything: the university where he taught in Austin, the books he was reading, the political state of Texas, and he had a way of drawing Cornelius into conversation that was friendly without being pushy, asking questions about the ranch with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. Cornelius found himself talking more in 3 days than he usually talked in a month. On the second evening, James sat on the porch with him after supper while Opal cleaned up inside, and they could hear her singing to herself in the kitchen, a low, absent-minded sound like someone thinking in music, and James said with a sideways look at Cornelius, "She seems happier here than I've seen her in a long time." Cornelius said nothing, but he listened to the singing from the kitchen. "She had a hard few years," James said, not unkindly. "The school closing was the last in a series of disappointments. I worried about her." He paused. "She wouldn't say so herself. She doesn't talk about what's difficult. But she has a way of going very quiet that isn't the same as peace, and she was very quiet for a long time. She's not quiet like that now." Cornelius held his coffee cup and looked out at the dark land. "She's good at this," he said after a moment. "All of it. Better than I gave any thought to." "Did you think about it at all?" James asked with something that might have been gentle teasing. "Not enough," Cornelius said honestly. James looked at him for a moment and then smiled. A frank, warm smile that looked nothing like Garrett Hollies' smile and a great deal like Opal's low, private laugh made visible. "I think you're good for her too," he said. "She trusts you." That's not a small thing with Opal. She doesn't give trust easily. Cornelius thought about this for a long time after James went to bed. He sat on the porch in the September dark with his coffee cooling in his hands, and he thought about what it meant that she trusted him. And he thought about whether he deserved it. And he thought about the way she had walked across his land the first morning with her broken carpet bag, and her muddy hem, and her absolutely indomitable spine. And how she had sat at his kitchen table, and given him the most honest accounting of herself he had ever received from another person. And how he had been doing the same thing back without quite realizing it, and how they had been doing it consistently ever since. This exchange of plain truth instead of performance, and he thought that maybe this was what the word trust actually meant in practice. Not a feeling you decided to have, but a thing that was built day by day from the accumulated weight of honesty. He also thought about the afternoon light on her face, and the way she said the land was extraordinary. And he thought about the singing in the kitchen. And he thought that there was something happening in his chest that was considerably larger than a crack in his certainty now, and was perhaps more accurately described as a complete reassessment of the structural load-bearing elements. Which was a significant thing for a man who had built everything he owned with his own hands, and believed deeply in the importance of sound architecture. He went to bed without resolving any of it, because it was not the kind of thing you resolved in an evening, but he was at least willing to admit, in the privacy of the dark, that something needed resolving. The legal matter with Hollies took the better part of the fall. Marcus Webb came out in October, examined the original survey, walked the boundary with Cornelius and took careful notes, and confirmed what Opal had identified, which was that the original land grant placed the northeast boundary 40 yards further into what was currently treated as Hollies' territory, and that this section included the portion of the creek bank where the water rights were most significant. He wrote a letter to Garrett Hollies' attorney in November, citing the original survey and noting that the Barkers intended to formally reestablish their boundary line in accordance with the land grant documentation. The response from Hollies' attorney suggested that the survey in question was outdated and that subsequent arrangements had established the current boundary by mutual agreement, and requested documentation of those arrangements. Marcus Webb wrote back asking for their documentation. The documentation, it developed, did not exist in any conclusive form, which put the position considerably in the Barkers' favor. The fence gutting stopped in November, either because Hollies had received legal advice recommending restraint, or because the weather had become inhospitable enough to make nocturnal boundary harassment impractical. Cornelius inclined toward the legal advice theory. He told Opal in December that Marcus Webb believed they had a strong position, and that Hollies would likely accept a settlement rather than risk a formal boundary hearing in court. Opal, who had spent the fall writing more letters, reorganizing more accounts, teaching herself the practical details of cattle operation with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to everything, and gradually, without any particular announcement, becoming as much a part of the working life of the ranch as he was, said, "Good. What he was doing was wrong and it should have a consequence. "It'll have one," he said. She nodded. Then she looked at him with those green eyes that saw things clearly and said, "You're not going to let it make you hard toward him, are you? The way some men do when they win something." He thought about it. "No," he said. "I want the boundary. I don't want a war." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the right answer," she said quietly, not as a judgment but as something she meant. He had been finding himself more and more aware of being looked at by her, of the moments when her attention landed on him directly, because she was a person who looked at things fully and her looking had weight to it. He was also finding himself more and more unwilling to look away when she did, which was new. He had spent 25 years avoiding anything that required sustained emotional exposure, and here was this woman who had been on his land for 8 months looking at him as if she could see everything he was and was not troubled by any of it, and he did not want to be the first to look away. He did not look away. Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken and substantial, and she took a breath and looked down at the table and then looked up again quickly, as if she had looked down by accident and wanted to correct it, and her cheeks had some color in them that had not been there before. He said, "Opal." She said, "Yes." He did not immediately follow this with anything, because what was in his chest was not yet in a form that language could carry without losing something essential, and he was a careful man and he did not want to lose anything essential. He said, "Will you walk with me this afternoon, on the land?" She looked at him for a moment and then she said, "Yes, I would like that." They walked out in the late afternoon, in the December light that was lower and cooler than the amber heat of the summer evenings, but still did the thing with the limestone, still laid itself across the grass in those long, burnished lines that made the ordinary landscape into something that asked something of you. They walked without much talk, which was not unusual for either of them, but there was a different quality to this particular silence, one that was alive in a way that silence between two people becomes when both of them are aware of it at the same time. They walked up to the limestone ridge to the east, where the live oaks grew in the hollows between the rocks and the creek was visible below, a dark ribbon catching the light. The cattle were small and slow in the far pasture. The sky was enormous and pale blue going to gold at the edges, and the air smelled of juniper and dried grass and the cold that was coming from the north. Cornelius stopped at the highest point of the ridge and looked out over his 1,200 acres, the same view he had looked at 10,000 times from this approximate spot, and he had always felt, looking at it, a profound and sufficient satisfaction. The satisfaction of something earned and kept and cared for. The satisfaction of the land itself, its beauty and its permanence and its indifference to everything human, including himself. He looked at it now and felt all of that, and also felt something else that he had not felt standing here before, which was the awareness of the person beside him, of her presence as a specific and irreplaceable fact, not a practical addition to the operation or a solution to a logistical problem, but a person who was Opal Sawyer and no one else, who had walked across this land in a ruined dress with blisters on her hands, and had not for a single moment considered that she might be defeated by it, who had looked at his south pasture in the amber light and called it extraordinary, who had found his land grant survey and his legal salvation in a lockbox under his bed, who sang to herself in the kitchen, who laughed at the cattle, who asked him hard questions and listened to his answers and gave him her own honest answers in return, who had said she was not a romantic person and who had been, in his private observation, consistently and deeply kind. He said without planning it, "I have loved this land more than I have loved anything in my life." She turned to look at him. He said, "For 25 years I thought it was enough. I thought it was what a man like me was built for. I thought loving a place was safer and cleaner than loving a person, because a place doesn't ask anything of you beyond your presence and your labor." She was very still. He said, "I understand now that I was loving the wrong thing, not instead of this land, which I still love and always will, but as a substitute for something I didn't believe I was capable of." He turned to look at her directly, and the light was on her face and in her eyes, and she was looking at him with an expression he had not seen before, something open and a little raw, the face of a person who is hearing something they had not known they needed to hear. "You walked across this land 8 months ago, and I watched you from my porch, and I thought you were a practical matter, a sensible addition. I have been working out ever since that I was completely wrong." She said nothing for a moment. The wind moved through the juniper below the ridge. The creek light shifted. She said, "I told you I wasn't a romantic person." "You told me that," he agreed. "I meant it at the time. I believed you." "I still mean it mostly," she said, and there was something in her voice that was careful and honest and very slightly unsteady in a way that he had not heard before. "I am still a practical person. I still think clearly about things, and I still don't have any patience for performances or pretty speeches that don't mean what they say." "I know," he said. "So when I tell you," she said, and paused and looked at him steadily, "that standing on this ridge with you right now is the closest thing to home I have felt in a very long time, I need you to know I am saying it because it's true and not because I think it's what you want to hear." He looked at her. The light was everything, and the land was underneath them, and the sky was enormous above them, and he thought that this was the moment you came to after years of building something correctly, when the structure finally showed you what it had been capable of holding all along. He reached out and took her hand, just her hand, in both of his, and held it. Her hands were not soft, because she had been working alongside him for 8 months, but they were warm, and she did not pull away. She turned her hand and held his back. They stood there on the limestone ridge in the December light, holding hands and looking out over 1,200 acres of land that had taken 25 years to become what it was, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that has said everything it needed to say and is now simply resting in what it made. Christmas that year was small and without pretension, which suited them both perfectly. James came from Austin for 3 days and brought a tin of coffee from a new import shop he had discovered, which Opal greeted with genuine enthusiasm. Mrs. Grubb sent a pie that arrived more or less intact in a basket with a note that said she hoped they were well and that she had been thinking of them. Dooley Fitch was given the 3 days off and went to see his sister in Lockhart, which he did every Christmas, and which Cornelius had not known until Opal found this out and told him, and which made Cornelius feel briefly that he had perhaps not paid enough attention to his hired man across 25 years. Cornelius gave Opal a new ledger book with her name embossed on the cover, because she had gone through 2 ledger books already, and he had noticed her making do with the margins of the second one. He also gave her a small brooch that he had found in the jeweler's window in Caldwell, a piece of turquoise set in silver, which he had seen in October and thought was the precise color of her eyes on certain mornings, and had bought without overthinking it, which was unlike him, and which he had not been sorry about. She held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Cornelius." "It's turquoise," he said unnecessarily. "From New Mexico," the jeweler said. "I know what it is," she said. She looked up at him. "It's beautiful." "I thought the color suited you," he said, which was more direct than he usually was and which he decided to leave standing. She gave him a pair of gloves she had ordered from a catalog in November, fine leather work gloves sized to his hands because she had measured the old ones while he slept one evening, which was slightly concerning in retrospect but had produced gloves that fit perfectly. She also gave him a book, A Natural History of the Texas Hill Country, written by a professor at the University of Texas, which she said she had found in Austin through James and thought he might like. He looked at the illustrations and thought that she had seen him in the book before he had, and that this was, in its quiet way, the most generous thing anyone had given him in years. He pinned the brooch to her collar himself, which required him to stand very close to her while he worked the clasp, and she stood still and looked up at him from this close distance with those green eyes, and he thought that proximity to a person you are falling in love with is a very specific thing, warm and a little precarious, like standing at the edge of a good height with the certain knowledge that the falling is not something to be feared. He finished with the clasp and looked down at her, and she was still looking at him, and her expression was the open, slightly unguarded one that he had only begun to see in the last month or two, the one that lived beneath the practical, composed, clear-eyed face that was her public architecture, and which was more private and more beautiful, and which she showed him, he understood, because she trusted him, and because she had decided he was worth showing it to. He kissed her. It was not dramatic in the way of stories. It was quiet and careful and warm and entirely real, and she kissed him back, and James made a sound from the other room that was deliberately audible and which they both ignored, and the fire in the hearth crackled, and outside the December wind moved through the juniper on the hill, and the land was quiet and enormous and entirely itself under the winter sky. He settled his forehead against hers afterward, and she said, so quietly that it was almost just breath, "I think I have been falling in love with you since approximately the 3rd week." He said, "I have been working on it longer than that, and I am slower to these conclusions than I should probably admit." She laughed, the low private sound, close enough that he could feel it more than hear it, and he thought that there was not a single thing in all 1,200 acres of the land he loved that was more worth having than this. The new year came in cold and clear, and 1894 arrived with a quality of brightness that felt earned. The legal matter with Garrett Hollies was resolved in February by a boundary agreement that restored the original survey line, giving the Barkers formal title to the 40 yards of creek bank in the northeast corner. Hollies accepted the settlement without warmth but without further contest, and Marcus Webb drove out from Austin in the spring to record the new deed and stay for supper, during which he ate 3 helpings of Opal's venison stew, and told them both that he had rarely seen a boundary case resolved so cleanly, and that it was largely due to the quality of their documentation. Dooley Fitch repaired the fence along the corrected boundary line in March, and Cornelius walked it with him on the first warm day of spring, checking every post and wire, and when he came back to the house, Opal was sitting on the porch reading with the sun on her, and she looked up and said, "All well." "All well," he said, and meant it in a way that included considerably more than the fence. That spring they rode out together most afternoons, the two of them on horseback across the land, because she had grown up with horses and rode well, and it was different from walking. The land opened differently at that pace, wider and faster, the hills and the creek hollows and the limestone formations coming at you and falling behind, and he showed her parts of the ranch he had not yet walked her through, the far eastern reach where the cedar was thick and the deer came through at dawn, the north meadow where the wildflowers came up in such profusion in April that the ground looked like a painting, the high point on the western boundary, where on a clear day you could see the low smudge of the hill country fading into blue distance. She was quiet at the high western point, the way she was quiet when something was moving through her that she was going to eventually put into words but was still assembling. He sat his horse and waited, which was something he had learned to do without impatience, because what she produced from her silences was always worth the wait. She said, "I want to plant something here." He said, "Here where we're standing, on the ranch. I want a garden. Not just vegetables, though I want those too. I mean something permanent, fruit trees, maybe some roses along the south side of the house, something that will be here after us." He looked at her. She was looking at the distance with the expression she wore when she was not looking at what was in front of her but at something she could see that had not happened yet. He said, "What kind of fruit trees?" She turned and looked at him, and she smiled, which she did more readily now, freely and without self-consciousness, a smile that started in her eyes and then arrived in the rest of her face like something that could not be contained. "Peach," she said. "And maybe 1 apple, although I know the soil is difficult for apple, and possibly pear. We can ask the man at the feed store about soil amendments," he said. "He knows what grows. You don't think it's impractical?" She said, watching him, "I think it's exactly right," he said, and he meant this in every sense of the word, the practicality of a fruit garden and also the larger rightness of a woman who had arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and a blistered hand, deciding that she wanted to put something permanent in the ground here, that this land was hers to plant in, and that what she planted would be here after them both. She looked at him for a moment longer and then nodded, satisfied, and turned her horse back toward the house. He followed her, and the spring light was on her back and the land was green and breathing around them, and he thought that 25 years had made him very good at knowing this place, its moods and its seasons and its particular ways of being beautiful, and that he had been wrong to think that knowing a place was the same as having enough. You could love the land truly and well. He did. He would his whole life, but the land could not love you back. It could not look at you from across a kitchen table with those clear green eyes and hear all the versions of what you said at once. It could not walk 3 miles through the mesquite and the dust and the morning heat and arrive at your porch steps with blistered hands and an undefeated spine and sit down in your only chair and ask for water. It could not trust you. It could not plant peach trees for the people who would come after you. It could not be the thing that made the amber light mean more. He had loved the land more than any living thing for 25 years, and it had been, in its way, enough to get him here. But he understood now, with a clarity that sat in him, the way the limestone sat in the hill country, deep and foundational and just barely visible, that he had been loving the wrong thing. Not a wrong thing, the wrong thing. The land was right to love, but it was not the love that made a life. This was, she was. By the summer of 1894, they had planted the peach trees, 6 of them along the south slope below the house, and 1 pear tree that the man at the feed store promised would do well if it was watered through the dry months, and the roses along the south side of the house that she had mentioned were begun in a line that would take 2 or 3 years to fully establish, but were already in their first season, producing enough color to be visible from the yard gate. Dooley Fitch, who had watched all of this with the expression of a man who finds that his life has rearranged itself pleasantly without his direct involvement, had taken to leaving the first roses of the morning cut and sitting in a small jar on the porch step, which he denied doing whenever anyone mentioned it, and which Opal received each morning without comment, and with a smile that she aimed at the middle distance, not wanting to embarrass him. She told Cornelius about it one evening, and he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I'll be damned. He's been here 12 years and I didn't know he had it in him." "Everyone has something in them," she said, "if you give them a chance to show it." He looked at her. He said, "Is that something you learned from teaching school?" "I learned it from the children," she said. "Yes, every one of them had something they were hiding that turned out to be a gift." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned it and held his the way she had on the ridge that December afternoon, simply and without theater. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "I have not been good at this. At being a person with another person. I was not well constructed for it to begin with, and I have spent a long time alone on this land, and I know that I am too quiet and too set in how I do things, and there have been mornings when I have not said a kind word because I did not think to say it, not because I didn't feel one." She listened to this without interrupting. He said, "I'm trying to get better at it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Cornelius, you brought wildflowers for my room the day I arrived. You didn't say anything about them, you just put them there." He looked at her. She said, "I don't need a man who makes speeches. I need a man who puts wildflowers in the room when he doesn't know why he's doing it and then stays." She looked at him steadily. "You've stayed. Every morning you're here and every evening you're here, and you've been honest with me every single day, and you've made me feel like this is my land and my home and my life, and that is more than most people get. You don't need to get better at it. You just need to keep doing it." He felt the full weight of her, the full fact of her, in a way that made it briefly difficult to speak, and so he said nothing and tightened his hand around hers, and she understood this perfectly because she was Opal, and she had understood everything he meant without requiring him to say it from nearly the beginning. That fall she told him she was pregnant. She told him on a September morning before he went out, matter-of-factly, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, the way she told him most things, plainly and directly, and without wrapping it in anything it didn't need. He stood very still in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at her. She said, "I've spoken to Mrs. Hendricks in town, who is the midwife. She says everything appears to be going well. The baby would come in late April." He said, "Are you all right?" "I'm well," she said, "tired in the evenings, otherwise well." He crossed the kitchen and sat down across from her, which he had not been intending to do, and he looked at her, and he thought about late April, and about the peach trees which would be in blossom in late April, and about the fact that this land that he had worked for 25 years with his hands and his stubbornness and his love, was going to produce not just grass and cattle and creek water and limestone, but a person. And that the person would be made of him, and of this woman who had walked across it without stopping. And the thought was so vast and so bright that it took up all the available space inside him. He reached across and put his hand on her face, just his hand, warm against her cheek, and she looked at him with those green eyes, and she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and everything that needed to be communicated moved between them without words. The winter was mild, which the farmers said was an omen of good things, though they said that every winter regardless of the temperature. Opal continued managing the accounts, continued riding until the cold made it uncomfortable, and then walked instead. Cornelius watched her with an attention that he had stopped pretending was merely practical, and which was simply the attention of a man who is looking at the person he loves, and finding that looking is one of his consistent and genuine pleasures. He asked her one evening in January what she would want to name the baby. She was sitting by the fire with a book, and she looked up and considered this with the same seriousness she brought to questions about the Creek rights. "If it's a boy," she said, "I would like to name him for my father. His name was Thomas." "Thomas Barker," Cornelius said. "That's a good name." "If it's a girl," she said and paused, "I've been thinking about the land. About what this place is. I think I would name her something for it." "Something for the land," he said. "Something for the hill country, the limestone, the creek. The way the light falls on it." She looked at him. "Something that sounds like it belongs here." He thought about this. He said, "June. June falls like the light on the limestone, clear and warm." She looked at him for a long moment, and the firelight was in her eyes, and she said, "Yes, June, that's right." Thomas Barker arrived on an evening in late April of 1895, not a morning as Mrs. Hendricks had predicted, but an evening, with the sun going down in its amber and rose ceremony over the western hills and the peach trees outside the window, standing in full white blossom. He arrived loud and red and emphatically present, and Cornelius, who had been pacing the porch for 3 hours in a state of focused terror that he would never have admitted was terror to any living person, was let in by Mrs. Hendricks with the expression of a woman who has watched many fathers in this same doorway, and found them all approximately equal parts ridiculous and touching. He stood by the bed where Opal was holding their son, both of them exhausted and incandescent, and he looked at this small red face and this dark head of hair and these miniature, furious fists, and then he looked at Opal, who was looking at the baby with an expression that was entirely new, something enormous and tender and fierce all at once that he had not seen before and thought he might not have the capacity to fully contain. She looked up at him and said, "He has your stubbornness already. Look at those fists." He sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and he said, "Can I hold him?" She transferred the small, warm, terrible weight to his arms, and he held him, carefully, and with the absolute concentration of a man who understands that he is handling something infinitely more precious than anything he has ever been given. And Thomas Barker opened his eyes briefly, dark and unfocused, and closed them again with the magnificent indifference of the newborn. Cornelius thought about the land. He thought about 1,200 acres of limestone and grass and creek water and live oak, All of it his and hers, and now this small, new person's. He thought about peach trees in blossom and wildflowers cut before dawn, and a carpet bag dropped on a porch and green eyes that refused to look away. He thought about a woman who had walked 3 miles through the mesquite without stopping, and who had, in the process, walked through every wall he had built around himself over 25 years with such natural ease that he had not even felt the moment they came down. He thought about what it meant to finally understand the difference between loving a place and loving a life. He said, quietly, not directing it at anyone in particular, "Hello, Thomas." The years that followed moved the way good years move, with the weight and richness of things that are both ordinary and irreplaceable. Thomas grew as children grow in the hill country, which is to say with tremendous energy, and the stubborn attachment to the outdoor world that seemed to be a combination of his father's nature and his mother's capacity to walk toward whatever interested him without hesitation. By the time he was 2, he had a strong opinion about the horses. By the time he was 3, he had a strong opinion about everything. Dooley Fitch, who had never to anyone's knowledge spent significant time around children, developed an unexpected aptitude for the management of Thomas, which manifested primarily in the teaching of skills that Opal sometimes felt required a conversation about age-appropriateness, but which Cornelius thought were fundamentally sound. By 3.5, Thomas could identify all 12 horses by name and knew the correct way to approach each one from the near side. This seemed to Cornelius like an entirely reasonable body of knowledge for a person of any age. The ranch grew. Not dramatically, not with the explosive expansion that some men chased and some lost everything to, but steadily and soundly, the way Cornelius Barker had always done everything. He bought 60 acres to the south in 1896 when the neighboring family chose to move to San Antonio, and Opal extended the grazing rotation to account for it, and by the end of the decade the herd was pushing 400 head. The accounts were clean and clear and showed growth every year, because Opal kept them with the precision of a woman who had spent 7 years teaching arithmetic and had discovered a genuine talent for its application. In the summer of 1897, Opal told him she was pregnant again. She told him in the same kitchen, at the same table, in the same matter-of-fact way she had told him the first time, and he sat down across from her the same way and looked at her with the same full attention, but this time there was no stilled shock in it, only the warm, expansive knowledge of what was coming, which he already knew the shape of from having lived it once and found it more than he had words for. She said, "Mrs. Hendricks says spring again." He said, "Are you all right?" "I'm well," she said. "Same as before." He reached across the table. She took his hand. He said, "If it's a girl," she smiled. "June," she said. June Eleanor Barker arrived on a bright morning in March of 1898, which was slightly ahead of Mrs. Hendricks's predicted date, but not so much as to cause alarm. And she arrived with considerably more efficiency than her brother had, and considerably more quiet, looking around the room with dark eyes of an almost uncanny composure for a person who had been born 40 minutes prior, as if she was doing an initial survey of conditions and finding them acceptable. Cornelius held her and thought that she looked like Opal in some way he could not precisely identify, perhaps only in the quality of her attention, the sense that she was examining everything fully and would reach her conclusions on her own schedule. Thomas, who was nearly 3 and had been waiting in the kitchen with Dooley for the portion of the morning he was not allowed to witness, was brought in to meet his sister. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "She's very small." "You were also very small," Opal told him. Thomas considered this. "Can she ride yet?" "Not yet," Cornelius said. "I will teach her," Thomas said with great authority. And Dooley, who was standing in the doorway, made a sound that was definitely a laugh, and then covered it with a cough. Opal looked up at Cornelius from where she was propped against the pillows, and he looked down at her, and she had the enormous, tender, fierce expression again. And he sat on the edge of the bed with June in his arms and Thomas pressed against his side and Opal's hand in his free hand. and outside the window the peach trees were not yet in blossom, but the first green was showing on them, the new leaves coming in, and the creek was running full from the winter rains. And the sky over the hill country was the particular pale blue of an early March morning that had decided to be beautiful. He thought about the first morning she had walked across this land. He thought about the figure he had seen from the porch in the before sunrise dark, coming across the south pasture with a carpet bag and a hat she had stopped caring about, and a stride that had not considered stopping. He thought about what it was to love a place with everything you had for 25 years and then understand, in a moment of amber light on a woman's face, that you had been loving the wrong thing. Not the land. Never the land. The land was right and good and was home in the deepest sense of the word. But the land alone, the land instead of people, the land as sufficient company and substitute for anything human. He thought about what it meant to understand that a man could love a piece of ground and also love a woman, and those were not competing things, not alternatives between which you chose, but two separate and necessary truths of a full life, and that having only one of them was having half of something magnificent. He thought that he had spent 25 years getting the land ready and had not known until she walked across it that he had been getting it ready for her. Garrett Hollis sold his neighboring ranch in 1899 and moved to Dallas, which Cornelius heard from the county recorder's office with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been correct about a boundary line. The new neighbor to the northwest was a family from East Texas, the Aldridge family, husband and wife and 4 children, who arrived in the spring and immediately announced themselves as the kind of neighbors it was entirely pleasant to have, which Opal determined within 3 conversations and Cornelius determined within 3 weeks, which was how long it took him. Clara Aldridge became Opal's first real friend in the hill country, which was something Cornelius had not considered might be missing from Opal's life, until he saw the difference it made. The way Opal came home from a Sunday afternoon at the Aldridge place, with an energy and lightness in her step that spoke of something fed that had been quietly going unfed. He mentioned this to her one evening, not as a criticism but as an observation, and she looked at him with something that was half exasperation and half fondness and said, "Yes, Cornelius, women need to talk to other women sometimes." "I know that," he said with slight dignity. "I just didn't think you weren't." "I was," she said. "Now I am more so. It's not a complaint about you." "I know it isn't," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You worry sometimes that you're not enough," she said, which was so direct and accurate that he experienced a brief and very unfamiliar desire to be looking at a different point in the room. She said, "You are enough. You have always been enough. That is a completely separate matter from the fact that I also like to have coffee with Clara Aldridge on Sunday afternoons." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He looked at her. He said, "You chose this. You walked 3 miles to get here and you looked at me on that porch and you chose this." She held his gaze. "I did," she said, "and I would walk it again." He reached out and touched her face, his hand warm against her cheek the way it had been on the day Thomas was born, and she leaned into it the smallest degree, and he thought that this was what 25 years of loving the land had taught him, that the things worth having were worth the patience of learning them, that you did not understand a piece of ground in one season. You understood it in all the seasons together, and a person was the same. You understood them in all the seasons. In the cold and the heat and the storms and the still, clear days, and each season showed you something the others hadn't. He understood Opal Sawyer in every season now, and each one had shown him something more than the last. The new century came and the world changed as it does, the railroads expanding, the towns growing, the old wild emptiness of the Texas hill country becoming something slightly less wild, not tamed exactly. The land never entirely permitted that, but domesticated in ways that Cornelius sometimes thought about on long evenings when the memory of what it had been was still very clear. He thought about the first years, the absolute solitude of them, the mornings with no one on the land for 3 miles in every direction. He did not miss the solitude. He was surprised sometimes by the completeness of his not missing it. Thomas grew tall and brown and serious in the way of his father, with his mother's ability to read people, and a genuine love of the land that he had absorbed from both of them simultaneously, a love that was practical and also aesthetic, knowing where the water ran and also watching the evening light on the limestone with his mother's focused quiet. He rode well. He was patient with the cattle. He had a temper that arrived rarely and left quickly and did not linger, which was, in Cornelius's private assessment, significantly better than his own at the same age. June was everything her morning's calmness had promised, a child of tremendous self-possession and dry observation, who had strong opinions about books and horses and the proper way to manage the peach harvest, and absolutely no patience for anything she considered imprecise. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's physical stillness. This particular quality of holding herself quiet when she was thinking that Opal said made her look exactly like Cornelius standing on the porch at sunrise, which Cornelius found both accurate and somehow moving. In the spring of 1902, on a morning in late April that was very warm and smelled of rain that had fallen the night before, Cornelius Barker walked out onto his porch before the sun was up and stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked east at the horizon in its deep bruised purple turning to gold. And he thought about the morning 9 years prior when a woman had appeared in that south pasture with a carpet bag and a hat she had given up on. He heard the door behind him and she came out and stood beside him. Opal, 40 years old now, and as clear-eyed and direct and deeply familiar to him as the land itself, wearing her old blue robe and holding 2 cups of coffee, and she gave him one and stood beside him at the porch rail and looked at the same horizon. They stood like that for a while, not speaking, and the sky did its slow, extraordinary performance for them, the way it had done it every morning of their lives and would do it after them. And the peach trees below the house were in full white blossom, and June had asked last week what the blossom smelled like, and Thomas had explained it to her with a seriousness that made both his parents want to smile and not want to interrupt. And Dooley Fitch had been with them for 22 years now, and had recently been given a raise that he had tried to decline, and Opal had refused to let him decline. And the East Creek ran clean and full within the proper boundary, and the 400 head of cattle were quiet in the near pasture, and the limestone ridge caught the first true light of the sun and turned briefly to gold. Opal said, "Thomas asked me yesterday if he could take over the southern section when he's older." Cornelius turned to look at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes," she said simply. "This land needs someone who loves it the way we do. He does." He looked back at the horizon. He thought about 25 years of loving a piece of ground, and what it had made him, and what it had not. He thought about what had been missing, and about the morning it had arrived in a ruined blue dress with blistered hands and an absolutely indomitable spine. He said, "You know what I was thinking about this morning?" "What?" she said. "That morning you walked across the south pasture. I was standing here where I am right now, and I watched you come across it, and I thought you were a practical matter, a logistical solution." She made a sound that was a laugh compressed into a breath. "You were so careful," she said. "Everything you said was careful. I thought you were going to send me back to the boarding house." "I thought about it," he said honestly. She looked at him. "You did not. Not seriously," he allowed. "Mostly I thought you were the most determined person I had ever seen on foot." "My feet," she said, "were in extraordinary pain." "You didn't show it." "Showing it would not have helped the situation," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman beside him in the before sunrise morning with coffee in her hand, and the horizon light beginning to find her face. This woman who had walked across his land without stopping, and in doing so had walked through everything he had built to keep himself at a sufficient distance from wanting more than the land could give him. He said, "I understand something now that I didn't understand then." She waited. He said, "I thought the land was enough because it was honest." because it asked only work and presence, and it gave beauty and sustenance in return, and nothing about that arrangement required me to be vulnerable to anything that could leave or change or choose to be somewhere else. And now, she said, watching him, he said, now I know that the land was always asking me to be ready for something more. All those years I spent learning every acre of it, every creek bend and limestone hollow and dry wash and rise. I thought I was loving it for its own sake, and I was, but I was also, without knowing it, learning how to receive something, how to be in a place fully and pay attention to it and stay with it in the difficult seasons. He looked at her. I was learning how to love you. I just didn't know it until you walked across it. Opal was quiet for a moment. The horizon was fully gold now, and the light was coming, the amber warmth of it spreading across the south pasture, and the cattle were beginning to move in the near meadow, and somewhere in the house Thomas or June was awake and moving about, the small domestic sounds of a family beginning its morning. She said softly, "Cornelius." He said, "Yes." She said, "I walked 3 miles through the mesquite with blistered hands because I had nowhere else to go, and I was not going to let that stop me. And then I got here and I looked up at this enormous, stubborn, silent man on his porch, and I thought, well, this is going to require patience." He said, "I know I'm not easy." "You are not," she agreed. "But you are exactly what I needed and what I wanted once I understood what wanting something again felt like." She reached over and took his hand the way she had taken it on the ridge that December, simply and without theater. "I chose this place. I chose you. And I would make the same choice 10,000 times." He held her hand and looked out at the light on his land, on their land, on this place that would someday also belong to Thomas with his serious face and his mother's reading of people, and to June with her green eyes and her father's stillness, and beyond them to whoever came after. And he thought that a man spent his life building things, fences and water rights and herd counts and years of solitary mornings, and all of it was good and necessary, but none of it was the point. The point was standing beside him in the before sunrise morning with coffee in her hand and the amber light coming in from the east. He had loved the land more than any living thing for 25 years. He had told himself it was enough. He had believed it. And then she had walked across it and he had understood, with the slow, certain geological clarity of a man who builds carefully and does not come to conclusions lightly, that he had been loving the wrong thing, not the land. The land was right to love, and he would love it until his last day, and his children would love it after him, and that love was real and true and woven into everything he was. But alone it was not a life. It was only the preparation for one. She had arrived and made it the real thing. He tightened his hand around hers and she leaned, very slightly, against his arm, and the sun came fully up over the Texas hill country, warm and brilliant and vast, and lay itself across 1,200 acres of limestone and grass and creek water and peach trees in blossom, and the long, patient life of two people who had come to each other sideways and truthfully and had built, from practicality and plain speaking, and the slow, astonishing accumulation of trust. Something that neither of them had entirely known they needed until they were already inside it, home. The peach trees bloomed every April and bore fruit every August, and the roses came back every year thicker along the south wall of the house, and Thomas grew into his father's boots and his mother's intelligence, and learned to read the land the way Cornelius had taught it to him, by being in it in all its seasons and paying attention. June grew into a young woman of remarkable precision and warmth, and at 15 was already keeping the secondary accounts with a thoroughness that made Opal look at Cornelius across the kitchen table, with a quiet smile that said everything. Dooley Fitch stayed on through it all, growing older with his customary silence and his secret early morning roses, and he taught Thomas about horses with the same thoroughness he had taught everything he knew. And in 1905 he told Cornelius he was thinking of retiring to Lockhart to live near his sister, and Cornelius shook his hand and said that was more than fair, and Opal made a supper that Dooley later told his sister was the best meal he had eaten in 40 years. and they hired a young man from the county to take his place, and duly left in the spring. And there was something in the leaving of a man who had been there for 23 years that was the particular bittersweet of things ending correctly, not tragically but as they were meant to, in the right season. James Sawyer came from Austin every Christmas and stayed until the new year, and got older with the particular grace of a man who has made his peace with time, and his presence in the house was as settled and expected and welcome as the cold and the stars of the December sky. Cornelius Barker, at 60 years old, was a man who sat on his porch in the evenings with his wife beside him, and watched the land go purple and gold in the dusk, and said very little, because very little needed to be said, and felt the full, completed weight of a life that had become, somewhere between a carpet bag on porch steps and a hand held on a limestone ridge, exactly what a life was supposed to be. He had stopped thinking of it as surprising that he was happy. Happiness, he had learned, was not a state you arrived at and remained in without effort. It was something you maintained the way you maintained the land, with attention and work and presence in all the seasons, and with the willingness to repair what broke and to stay with what was difficult, and to keep your eyes on what mattered even when the practical demands of everything else made it easy to look away. He never looked away. She was always there when he looked, Opal, with her green eyes and her practical heart, and her extraordinary love for the amber light on the limestone. And she looked back at him without flinching the same way she had looked up at him from the base of his porch steps on that April morning 9 years and now 20 years ago, with the absolute, steady, unflinching clarity of a woman who had made her choice and was not in the habit of reconsidering. On an evening in late May of 1910, Cornelius Barker sat on his porch with Opal and watched the sun go down over the western hills, and the peach trees below the house were heavy with the fruit that was coming in, and the roses were in full bloom along the south wall, red and yellow, and the deep pink that June had selected from the catalog 2 springs ago with great authority, and the cattle were moving in the far pasture the way they always moved at this hour, slow and deliberate. And the sky was the color of everything beautiful at once. He thought about the first morning. He thought about the porch where he had stood and the land he had been looking at and the figure appearing across the south pasture, small and determined and refusing to stop. He reached over and took Opal's hand. She took his. He said without looking away from the horizon, "You know what today is." "What?" she said. He thought about it. "Today is exactly the kind of evening I used to spend alone on this porch thinking the land was enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And now?" He turned and looked at her, and the light was on her face and in her green eyes that were the same as they had been the first morning and also entirely different, deeper, and more familiar and more precious, the way everything becomes when you have had the time to truly learn it. He said, "Now I know that the land was just keeping me company until you arrived." She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she smiled, the full smile, the one that started in her eyes and could not be contained, and she leaned against his shoulder the way she had been leaning against it for 17 years, warm and easy and entirely home. The sun continued its ancient performance over the hill country. The creek ran in the east. The peach trees stood in the May evening. The land breathed and was still and was beautiful, as it had always been and would always be, asking nothing and giving everything, the same as it had on the morning a woman walked across it without stopping, and a man finally understood that he had been ready for a very long time. He held her hand. She held his. The evening went gold, and then amber, and then the deep, soft purple that preceded the stars, and the stars came out over 1,200 acres of Texas hill country, enormous and bright and indifferent and magnificent, and underneath them, on a cedar porch with roses blooming along the south wall and peach trees below, and children's voices somewhere inside the house, and a life built from plain speaking and true staying, and the slow, patient accumulation of love. 2 people sat with their hands together and did not say anything else, because everything worth saying had been said, and everything worth having was already here.